on the items that will be made available, but you'll be able to get beanies, hats, shirts, hoodies, umbrellas, things like that. I'm trying to talk them into doing, you know, a big canopy, but that'll be something, since they don't keep them in stock, they'll have to go buy the canopy, right? Then they'll have to screen print everything on it. And so I'm not sure about the cost of that yet. But we're not going to mark the items up too much because it isn't all about us making money off of it as it is to continue to build the brand, okay? Because the more we build the brand, the larger we grow as a club, the more influence we have in the community, and that also, in turn, helps us to keep playing costs low. One last thing is, I've been approached by UPSL. I don't know if you guys are familiar with UPSL. It's United Premier Soccer League. It's Division 4 in the U.S. soccer pyramid. They would like to see us have a team here. I've been approached by USL also, USL's 3rd division, about possibly being able to have a team here. The 3rd division used to be the PDL. And so there's a lot of things we're looking at being able to do, but in order for us to do that, it's about facilities, right? And once again, it's about sponsors. You know, for the USL, we would have to have an ownership group, right? We could still run through the club, but we would have to have an ownership group also so they could be affiliated with us. UPSL, we could run it straight through the club. You know, Florence Soccer could handle all of that. So there's a lot of things we're looking at doing. It just takes a lot of time. And while I'm on the subject of time, volunteerism is very, very important to us, okay? There's not a single board member that gets paid. We can. It goes against our bylaws. But we put in countless hours, okay? We do have a few staff members who are paid staff members. Tamara, she puts in, it's probably more like a full-time job for her than it is the part-time job that we envisioned it being, but she's the super glue. She takes care of everything. She makes sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, because we all have lives, we all have children that play this beautiful game also, and we have to work our normal, for most 9-to-5 jobs so we can maintain this. But I definitely appreciate everyone coming out today. We do have some speakers that are going to cover some very, very important topics. We even have Dr. McCants from Francis Marion University. She's here with us, and she's going to be talking about diversity and inclusion, because as we continue to grow the club, we're going to be going outside of comfort zones for some. So it's important that that we get the necessary skills in order to be able to do that. All right? So Trey?
Again, thank you for everybody being here. Just to touch, thank you, Tony, for those remarks. And next topic is going to be pretty sensitive. At that time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Buddy Scearce for the sexual abuse awareness part.
All right. I brought my coffee up here because it's too early. And I didn't take my medicine this morning, so I might be a little hyper. All right, so we're going to talk for a little bit about the topic of sexual abuse awareness and prevention. And, you know, a quick word of caution that this can be a very sensitive subject. So, you know, in a group like this, and especially a group as large as our club, and if you include all of our coaches and all of our volunteers, it's something that impacts us significantly. And, you know, it's starting to get more attention in our society, but in a lot of ways, I think it's becoming one of those things that people think isn't as real as the news portrays it, and sadly, it's the opposite. So to start off with, I just want to first talk about what is sexual abuse, right? It's a term that for the most part, we know it when we see it. But it actually involves a lot more than what we hear about on the news, right? The things that make the headlines. That's the kind of the tip of the iceberg. Sexual abuse, the definition of it is any tricked, forced, manipulated, or coerced sexual activity for the pleasure of the abuser. Okay, that's a very kind of educational, clinical definition. But some things to point out there is that that includes a lot of things, right? And why does it include all these things? You don't even actually have to touch a child physically in order to be found guilty of sexual abuse. Well, why is that? Well, the reason that's so important is that sexual functioning and sexual identity and sexual completeness is kind of a newer term that people use, is something that children are forming as they grow up. And if they get introduced into those types of topics too early, it confuses that boundary. They struggle with trust growing up, and it really has a significant impact. I didn't include all the stats in this presentation because I didn't want to bore everyone, but the relevant data shows that children that have what we would call adverse childhood experiences, okay, the death, the age of death or the mortality rate drops significantly. Crime increases, academic achievement decreases, and it is a direct correlation. So while we might kind of snicker at some things or just say, well, that's just a rite of passage, sadly, that's not true, because the kids that are affected, it ruins lots of lives. So let's talk about a couple of misconceptions. And this is misconceptions for us as a club. I think it's for us as a community, and I think it impacts all organizations, especially ones like Florence Soccer, right, where we kind of do this together, right? We're all in this together. So I implicitly trust the other person, the other coach. I don't really know them that well, but I trust them. And so the misconceptions are that, yeah, it's a problem, but it's not a problem for us because we're good people, right? But that would never happen here because we care about our athletes. And that's sadly not true. So another misconception is it's not that big of a problem. It's something that's overhyped. I hear that a lot. You know, well, the news makes a big deal out of it because it keeps people tuned in. But there are 60 million survivors of sexual abuse in our country. 1 in 4 females before the age of 18, and 1 in 6 males will experience some form of sexual abuse. Now, maybe it didn't happen to you, but it's happening to people around you. 66% of victims do not reveal the abuse until they're adults. So when we think about our athletes, and I'm going to interchangeably call them children and athletes because I like that we call them athletes within a sporting context, but they're children. This is impacting the kids in our club. And I think we need to wake up. If you take the national averages and you take the averages of our participation, which varies, by spring or fall, approximately 120 players in our club today between both select and rec have been or will be the victim of some sort of sexual abuse before they turn 18. Right? And these are not just statistics, these are our kids. For those of you that are coaching, think about how many kids you've coached over the last few years. And if you just carry the stats out, and the stats are pretty clear and pretty homogeneous across demographics, there's a significant number of kids that you have coached that have been the victim of sexual abuse in one form or another. And if you look at this picture, and I apologize for the old picture, but it's the best one I had. There's a lot of kids there, and that's a lot of kids that have probably been impacted by sexual abuse. So the goal today is to help us become a little more aware of what we can do as a club to limit the impact of this. And a quick sidebar, it's not in my slides, but I'm a psychologist, and I have a private practice here in town. I consult at hospitals in Charleston and Florence and also in Columbia. And we are seeing a significant spike in the number of children that are admitted to inpatient psychiatric facilities secondary to sexual abuse. It's happening. There are reasons for that. I won't go into all that because I think it probably gets a little bit too sensitive for this setting. But we need to be very careful as a club that we do not become lazy or apathetic towards this problem, because the likelihood of it impacting us is increasing. So let's take a look at who the abuser is. What does an abuser look like? Well, here's some stats. 730,000 sexual offenders in the United States of America. This is all FBI statistics, so if you have a problem with it, take it up with the FBI. Less than 10% of abusers will ever come in contact with the police. Now, I want to go back to that definition of what is sexual abuse, because you think, well, that's got to be more than 10%. Well, it maybe is more than 10% for that tip of the iceberg, the things that are awful and horrible that we know about. But then there's all these other forms, all these other types of abuse that fly under the radar and sometimes are just accepted within a community. The average male offender who prefers to offend against male children has 150 victims prior to prosecution. And that might sound like unbelievable to you, like, well, that cannot possibly be true. But sexual abuse is not just that tip of the iceberg. All of the grooming behavior, and we'll get into that, all of that is a form of abuse. It's a blending of boundaries. It's a pushing of boundaries against these young men. And the abuser, and I'll go into this later, but they're actually abusing many kids before they find the kids that will allow them to go as far as they want. That's why this can happen and fly under the radar. The average male who prefers boys begins offending at the age of 13 but is not prosecuted until 35. What does that mean for us? Well, that means that we have children in our club who are athletes who could be the perpetrator. So we need to be watching not only for the adults that might be offending against children, but also athletes and children within our club who could be the perpetrator of abuse against another child, typically a slightly younger child, one they can control physically and emotionally. The average male who prefers girls has 52 victims prior to prosecution. And that is a significant difference in the number of victims. And so people say, well, why is that? A big part of the reason is that boys don't tell. So boys don't tell. They don't tell anyone when it happens to them. We've done a good job, not a great job, but an okay job of educating young women that you need to tell. But we have a massive problem with boys who feel that they shouldn't tell, that makes them weak and vulnerable, and they're just not going to tell. The other thing that plays into those statistics is that a lot of times with boys, especially if the perpetrator is a female, and I've heard the stories, we kind of wink and a nod, like, yeah, he was 15 and she was 25, but way to go, Well, that's not okay. That's abuse, and so sometimes that form of abuse is just never reported. So what types of abusers are there? Well, one that we see a lot about is the stranger. Stranger danger, right? We all grew up with that. Don't get in the white van with the guy that's going to give you candy. Very sensationalized view of what abuse looks like. A very sensationalized picture of the abuser that plays well on TV, but the fact is that is unbelievably rare. The typical abuser that we would label a stranger is someone typically that suffers from a severe mental illness like schizophrenia or something like that. And that's a very rare type of disorder. The fact is that 90% of the cases involve the abuser being known well to the child, whether that's a family member, a teacher, a youth leader, a youth pastor, and a coach. So the vast majority of the time, the types of abuse that we see come from settings like ours. There's also the preferential offender. So if it's not stranger danger, who is it? Well, it's the preferential offender. Someone who's capable of appropriate sexual relationships but prefers sexual gratification with children, usually with a specific set of circumstances or characteristics like age, personality, and family environment. And this is 94%, right? So what does that mean? Well, this is not the person who looks weird, right? We all think of that creepy guy, right? That's not reality. The reality is most perpetrators of sexual abuse look just like you and I. Like, they don't look like that weird, creepy guy. Here's another misconception, kind of based on that, is that I would be able to spot the abuser. I mean, I would know it, right? I would know it when I see it, right? Because it's a creepy guy who's hanging out when he shouldn't be there, who nobody knows, who just doesn't look quite right. But that's not reality. There's no visual profile for an abuser. They look just like us. The behavior, though, is visible if we know what to look for. And this is, I think, an important note. Abuse is hard to identify because the allegation will be difficult to believe about someone who's difficult to suspect. Even in my role going in and assessing children that have been admitted to a psychiatric facility secondary to this, I'm left sometimes wondering, like, wow, can it have been that bad? Like, the stories are just so unbelievable, and you think, well, how could this go on and nobody know? It's because no one talks about it. But that's what the abuser looks like. It looks like you and I, and a lot of times it looks very helpful, right? Very encouraging, very involved. Another misconception is that all abusers are men. Now, most of the abusers are men. 90% of them, 10% of them are women, and it's very hard to spot female abusers. There's actually a very, very low incident rate of female-to-female abuse. Most of those abuse cases that we know about, where the perpetrator is a female, occurs with slightly older pubescent males. And so again, a lot of that doesn't even get reported or even seen as abuse because it's almost like we think the young man has won or done something well in order to have that in their life, and that's just not the case. It's also hard to spot female abusers because so many of the traits that we see as positive feminine traits like nurturance and attention and care and concern are also signs of grooming behavior for abuse, so it's very difficult to spot that in women. Another misconception, and I touched on this earlier, is that all abusers are adults. We are seeing a significant rise in the number of perpetrators who are children. I was in Charleston yesterday interviewing a 9-year-old boy who sexually abused 3 very young children at the age of 9. Why is that? Well, we have generational abuse, things that happen within the family. And this happens far more than we're comfortable admitting. But families have long histories of abuse that's passed down. It becomes an accepted part of the family dynamic, and the children are learning earlier and earlier what this behavior is, but not what it means. And so we have a lot of abusive situations where the children don't even know what they're doing is wrong. They have an innate sense that it's wrong, but they don't really know why. Because those boundaries have been blurred and pushed for years, generationally through the family. The use of pornography has exploded. For any of you that have children over the age of 7, you need to be monitoring what they're looking at online. They get introduced to this very young by kids at school, and it becomes an insidious part of their life. Because it does, we have this physical response to that kind of stimulus, whether we understand what it is or not. The heart rate goes up, your body responds, and so kids don't even know what they're doing, but they get hooked on that adrenaline response that the pornography gives them, and it lowers the inhibitions when it comes to these things, so that by the time a child is 14 or 15, they may have been viewing pornography on a daily basis for 6 to 7 years. We also have a problem now that we call the empathy gap. And so this is where old people like me talk about social media and the dangers and how nobody knows how, Well, the real impact of that is a lack of empathy. Because what's happening is our children, as they get older and they grow up in this kind of Instagram, kids don't really use Facebook anymore, but Instagram and Snapchat kind of world where you're not standing face to face with someone who you're offending, right? You're teasing someone, bullying someone, picking on someone from miles away, right? And when I was a kid, if I said something like that to someone, I got a bloody nose. And so I learned really quickly, don't say things like that to people. That hurts. Or I really hurt someone and I saw how much it hurt them, and I learned at a young age not to do that. Our kids today, they don't have that kind of empathy because so often those exchanges happen asynchronously, right? I send a message, I post something, and then sometime later the person sees it. It doesn't happen in real time. So all of those are factors that are leading to this kind of spike in what we see as childhood offenders. So why can someone, or how can someone get to the point, and I'll talk mainly about adult offenders at this point, but how do they get to the point where they can rationalize abuse? These are all things that I've heard. I also go to the Florence County Jail every week and talk to a lot of inmates there who are the perpetrators of abuse, and this is what they say. It's not that big of a deal because we're not blood related. That's the standard that they use. Not that big of a deal because we're not really related. The victim asked for it or wanted it. They came on to me. This is an especially insidious one that I hear a lot nowadays, is that they're helping them by teaching them about these things because there are other people in the world that would do it in a harmful way, and they're doing it in a way that helps them. They're helping them to grow up. It's normal, it's happened for centuries. I hear that one, usually from people that are the victims themselves of generational abuse. I'm not hurting them because we didn't have intercourse. That's another one I hear a lot. And they didn't say no, so I think it was okay. So how can this happen? How can it happen? Well, the molester or the abuser, and I'll interchange those terms a little bit. There's a subtle difference, but we'll just kind of use them the same. They groom children, right? They groom them, and that's probably a term that a lot of you have heard before, like grooming the victim. They do this first by selecting a child, right? And who is that child that may have poor boundaries, the child that doesn't have a strong family support system, the kids that are on the fringes of the group, not usually the leaders or the kids that are front and center, but the kids that kind of hang in the back, and they identify those kids. But the other thing they do is they groom the gatekeepers, and that's who we are. We're the gatekeepers, okay? And they groom us. How do they do this? They groom us by being very helpful, right? By going the extra mile. And it's, at first, it feels good. Like, oh yeah, this person is very, very helpful. They were always there. They were always involved. They always had the kids' best interest at heart. But what they were actually doing is putting themselves in a position where the adults and the systems that were supposed to be watching stopped watching them because they weren't worried about them anymore, right? That's why we have this false sense of security, that we're immune to that because, well, I know this person, I know that person, they would never do that. The grooming process can be a very slow process. It's not, typically these patterns emerge over the course of years. So it's not something that happens in a week. Obviously, if there was a coach that showed up next week and came in and was very excited to be working with our U14 girls team and was a little too interested and too involved and too active on social media, that would raise suspicions. This typically happens over years, and it's a pattern. And what they do is they want to create a culture or an environment where abuse is possible. And you don't have to go too far back to see a very clear example of this, and I don't have the slides in here, but with Larry Nassar. Most of you probably recognize that name, the physician with the United States Gymnastics, where over the course of years he built a culture where, and this blows our mind to think about it now, but it's like that frog in the pot, right? The water, the temperature just turned up a little bit. He built a culture where it was perfectly normal for teenage girls to come to his hotel room at night to get treatment. How did he do that? He did that by slowly pushing the boundary. Slowly pushing the boundaries. They groom the victims. You know, can I move the boundary? Is this child okay with me giving them attention? That's the first boundary. Because too much attention, most kids don't feel comfortable, right? That guy's weird, I don't want to talk to him. But maybe this child doesn't have that boundary, so now that's the first step, right? Is this child comfortable with me being alone with them? Can I touch them in a non-sexual way? And it just steps ever so slowly towards abuse. They groom the gatekeepers by trying to find systems where people are willing to trust. This is an area where, as a soccer club, we have been in the past, I think less so now, but still now, we're very vulnerable to this because we need help. We're overworked, right? We're understaffed. And it's very easy to say, yeah, okay, great, yeah, help us do that, good, awesome, that takes something off my plate. And then as a gatekeeper, I totally missed the motivation or the reason why this person might be involved. They gain access to systems, right? What kind of systems? They volunteer, they pick career choices. I was reading an article yesterday about a school administrator and the pattern, going all the way back to the career choice. Had actually gone in a different career field, and through a series of events realized, well, if I go into education, then I'll have access to these kids. It's awful, but that's the truth. They gain the trust of caregivers. They create the appearance of being helpful and trustworthy and kind. And this is the last one is very important. They appear to be really, really skilled at meeting the child's needs. Now, I want to pause for a minute, okay? Because if I'm some of you, I might get a little nervous here. Like, well, so am I not supposed to be good at meeting their needs? Am I not supposed to be helpful? No, you are supposed to be. But we should be watching out and building a system and a culture that makes abuse very difficult, regardless of how helpful someone appears, right? Because that's the thing that, this happened at another club in South Carolina in the last 3 years, where a long-time volunteer and coach was involved in some things that they shouldn't be involved in, and it divides people because half the people are going, there's no way. You know, that person was so helpful and so good, but the fact is the gatekeepers just weren't paying attention. So they gain access, and then they start selecting victims. And I'll get through this pretty quickly here. Like I said, they're unconnected. They're on the fringe, these children. They're looking for someone to trust. They come from split homes. They come from environments where there's been trauma, lack of resources, whether it's financial resources, and the perpetrator will fill a role in that child's life, which is not a bad thing, but it's an insidious thing if people aren't watching. Single-parent homes need a father figure is a big part of it. They often use alcohol and drugs or interest in pornography or sex or things like that to gain access. And that's how they select the victim, because they're pushing the boundaries of so many kids. That's how you can get these really high numbers where there's actually been abuse that no one even thought of as abuse, because they've tried with so many kids to see who they can push the boundary. So what are the beginning stages? They test barriers, like I said, pushing that boundary out. They'll have sexual discussions, starting, frequently with jokes, or, this is a case, I think it was in Charleston, I can't remember where it was.